Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Doris Wise-Montrose, President of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors. The David Horowitz Freedom Center and Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors are thrilled to be hosting the inimitable and esteemed Humberto Fontova. I want to take a moment to let you know of our next co-sponsored event. On Tuesday, June 17th, we are hosting Professor William Jacobson of Legal Insurrection, who will be speaking on the efforts of the American Studies Association to boycott Israeli academics. Recently, CJHS organized an event that caused quite a stir: firearms instruction, a day at the shooting range. A reporter from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency asked to cover it. I said that he could, but only if he participated. He did and had one great time. His article came out a couple of days ago, and it has been picked up by at least 3 outlets that I saw. It is interesting that the idea of Jewish self-defense would garner so much attention in a country that has a vibrant Second Amendment right to bear arms. We have provided 2 articles as handouts, one of the best by Sharona Schwartz from The Blaze and from the Daily Forward, who had to give the title their own little special loving slant. The Firearms Safety and Instruction Program, which will be known as JewsCanShoot.com, for real, that's really it, will be offering a variety of classes and instruction. If you are interested in receiving notifications, we have a sign-up form. Humberto Fontova is the author of 3 critically acclaimed and internationally published books on the Cuban Revolution. He was born in Havana, Cuba in 1954 and escaped from Castro's communist regime in 1961 with his family. His father remained briefly in Cuba as a political prisoner, while Humberto and his family were accepted as political refugees in the USA. He holds a BA in political science from the University of New Orleans and a master's degree in Latin American studies from Tulane University. Humberto is a weekly columnist, a frequent commentator on both English and Spanish language media, and the author of 5 critically acclaimed and internationally published books, including Fidel, Hollywood's Favorite Tyrant, Exposing the Real Che Guevara, and his latest, The Longest Romance, The Mainstream Media and Fidel Castro. This regime, co-founded by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, jailed and tortured political prisoners at a higher rate than Stalin during the Great Terror, murdered more Cubans in his first 3 years in power than Hitler murdered Germans during his first 6, craved to ignite a worldwide nuclear war, and succored practically every terrorist group on earth, from the PLO to the Weathermen and from the Baader Meinhoff group to the FARC. Only 3 months ago, the Castro regime admitted to laundering funds for Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. As a result, the Castro brothers and Che Guevara managed to convert a nation with a higher per capita income than half of Europe and a high influx of immigrants into one that repels Haitians and boasts the highest suicide rate in the hemisphere. Who would guess any of the above from reading the mainstream media or watching the History Channel? Yes, those media recruits so valued by Che Guevara are still at it. Humberto's book, The Longest Romance, The Mainstream Media and Fidel Castro, is available for purchasing and signing. He will take your questions following his presentation. At this time, please turn off your cell phones and other electronic devices. We also would like to thank the Lux Sunset Boulevard Hotel and their staff for providing us with this beautiful venue. And now, prepare to be informed, prepare to be entertained. With great pleasure, I introduce to you Humberto Fontova.
Thank you so much. Thank you tremendously. This is an enormous honor to be here. And what's going to happen tonight is that we've got a few folks here of Cuban American heritage who know all this stuff back and forth, up and down. They know more of it than I do. In fact, some of them contributed to my books. Fernando Marquette is here, a brave man who fought at the Bay of Pigs, trying to liberate Cuba from Castro. So he's going to be sitting there going, oh my God, I know all this stuff. Why did I even come out here to hear all this stuff? But the whole point of this, folks, is outreach of sorts. I detest the term with a holy passion, but I'm going to use it. It's about consciousness raising. Excuse me, but that's exactly what it is. Because what we have had here for half a century, over half a century, folks, Castro and Fidel Castro and Che Guevara took over Cuba in January of 1959. Okay. And I'm going to start out by saying I tailor my speeches to my audience. And it should be known here that Fidel Castro's favorite line, in fact, it's the title of his most famous book, is titled, History Will Absolve Me. History will absolve me. You see that. You can Google that up and you'll see Fidel Castro all over the place. Do you know that he copied it, he lifted it word for word from Adolf Hitler's Rathaus speech after the putsch? Hitler's was a little bit different. Hitler said, go ahead and condemn me. The goddess of history will absolve me. But Fidel Castro in high school and college was a major Hitler fanatic. My father was at the University of Havana at the same time as was Fidel Castro. And Fidel Castro was often seen walking around campus with his copy of Mein Kampf. There were a lot of people who knew Castro very well. Rafael Diaz-Balart, his one-time brother-in-law, and his family, they will tell you, look, if Hitler had won World War II, and in 1959, the major anti-American power on earth was National Socialism instead of international socialism, communism, Castro would have been a Nazi because he had the personality for it. You could say he was a power monger. That's the only thing that mattered to the guy. And he would have been, and these people, and these I'm talking about people who knew Fidel Castro since childhood, and they said he would have been a Nazi. Now, you all know how you feel and how all sane people feel about Holocaust deniers, or even Holocaust minimizers, you know. Nobody takes them seriously, really. I don't know of too many people that do. Most people recognize that they're insane. They're quacks, nobody. So I'll tell my Jewish friends, can you imagine if Holocaust denial was the mainstream media view? That's how Cuban Americans feel, folks. That's how we feel. Every day, we can pick up the paper and we say, wait a minute, have we moved into the twilight zone, folks? What is going on here? It is an amazing, folks, we are talking about a regime, Castro and Che Guevara's, that murdered, I don't say execute because execution implies a judicial process. But Che Guevara described Cuba's judicial process very plainly. He said, judicial evidence is an archaic bourgeois detail. We execute from revolutionary conviction. Basically, Cuba's legal system was imported lock, stock, and barrel from Stalin's during the Great Terror. That is why you have the Jewish philanthropist Alan Gross in prison in Cuba right now. We're going on 5 years of being imprisoned. His trial was closed to the media. The media couldn't get near because they would see that it was a kangaroo. It was a Stalinist show trial. And you know, and this is especially galling for people who followed the extravaganza that followed the death of Nelson Mandela back in December. Oh my goodness, gee, this and that and the other, the most wonderful. I mean, from watching that extravaganza, you would really think that political prisoners who served, years in prison, especially black ones, would be of immense interest to the media, Well, folks, there are dozens of Cubans who served longer in Castro's prisons than Mandela suffered in South Africa. And by the way, Nelson Mandela was convicted by an independent judiciary during a trial that was full of international observers. And in fact, the man who wrote Nelson Mandela's authorized biography said the judge was scrupulously fair. So Mandela served his time in prison, and my goodness, as we saw back in December, he's just the most wonderful guy in the world, this and that and the other. Folks, there is Eusebio Peñalves, Roberto Martín Pérez, Chanes de Armas. There are just dozens of Cubans who suffered longer in Castro's prison, 90 miles from U.S. shores, folks, in an island crawling with news bureaus. ABC, NBC, ABC, CNN, everybody, NPR, everybody is in Cuba, and yet none of y'all have heard of those names that I just mentioned. Eusebio Peñalves, Roberto Martín Pérez, Chanes de Armas. Nobody's heard of it, and yet Cuba is crawling with press bureaus. These men suffered longer in prison than Nelson Mandela after being convicted in kangaroo trials, and nobody knows about them. That's the whole point of my book. If a Martian had come to Earth in 1959, 57 actually, and picked up the New York Times, he would have read an article by a guy named Herbert Matthews. My Cuban friends know that name, but probably most of you don't. He was a reporter for the New York Times, a leftist reporter. He went to Cuba, and he's the one who played up Fidel Castro, Robin Hood, George Washington, St. Francis of Assisi. I mean, he was going to do wonderful things for Cuba. Democracy, freedom, liberty, and so forth. So say the Martian reads this article in the New York Times, February of 1957, he says, well, that's pretty cool. I like that. That's great. Cuba was under a horrible dictatorship, the New York Times said in 1957. It wasn't Castro, it was a guy before Batista. And this guy, Fidel Castro, was going to liberate Cubans from that terrible, terrible crime that was the regime that they were suffering under. All right? The Martian leaves. The Martian comes back to Earth January of 1996. We're going on almost 40 years now. And he goes to Hollywood again. He picks up Time magazine. Time. What does he find? A headline, "The hottest ticket in Manhattan, Fidel Castro." He picks up Newsweek, "The toast of Manhattan, Fidel Castro." Fidel Castro could not keep up with the social invitations from Manhattan's elite. He had parties first sponsored by David Rockefeller at the CFR. David Rockefeller. They lined up, they fitted him. From there, he went to Mort Zuckerman's pad. Fifth Avenue pad, Mort Zuckerman. Holy, and there he had the cream. He himself tinkled his glass and said, "This is the cream of the cream." Diane Sawyer, Barbara Walters, Dan Rather, Mike Wallace, Ed Bradley, Tina Brown. They were lining up, crowding around him for his autograph. Diane Sawyer was so overcome with the emotion of meeting the mass murderer who wanted to incinerate her, by the way. We'll get to that in a minute. She lost control. She lost control, folks. She rushed up because there was a line of media people, prominent media people, to get his autograph. She lost control. She broke the line. She ran up to Fidel Castro, wrapped your arms around him and kissed him on the cheek. This stuff sounds outrageous, folks. It is fully documented in the book. It is fully documented. She couldn't control herself in a mass murderer's presence. That's 1996. The Martian comes back 2 years later in 1999, and he picks up Time magazine again. What do you know? Che Guevara is listed as hero and icon of the century among them. They listed several. And Che Guevara, a mass murderer, a Stalinist mass murderer, is listed as a hero and icon of the century right next to Mother Teresa. Folks, I'm not making this stuff up. This is fully documented in my book. The Martian comes back in 2011, just a couple of years ago. And he picks up Newsweek magazine. I'm not making this up, folks. He picks up Newsweek and he finds out that Newsweek magazine has an issue devoted to the best places on earth to live. The best countries, folks. The best countries on earth to live based on size. And when it came to medium-sized country, and they said the people that live in these countries are the luckiest people in the world. Cuba was #1 in the medium range. Cuba was among the best places on earth to live. Folks, I mean, like I say, is this the Twilight Zone? What happened in that interim between 57 and 20,000 to make it? I mean, did something happen that might cause sane people to question what I just mentioned was coming out in the media? First of all, his accolades came in Manhattan, right? In New York, from the New York Times. Folks, the Wall Street Journal, the capital of capitalism, gave a luncheon in Fidel Castro's honor in 1996. I've got pictures of it. It's documented in the book. What is going on here, people say? What happened in the interim? Well, twice that we know of, he tries to blow up Manhattan. The very people that were hailing him, first of all, during the missile crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, what we read in the media, well, Kennedy stood up to the Russians, said, you get those missiles out of there. And we won. They blinked, they gone. Complete poppycock. Complete poppycock. It is documented by Sergei Khrushchev, Khrushchev's own son. What got those missiles out of Cuba is that Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, the butcher of Budapest, Nikita Khrushchev's Stalin's most faithful enforcer and butcher in the Ukraine during the famine and during the Great Terror. This guy has seen a little bit of bloodshed, hasn't he? Khrushchev was appalled at what Che Guevara and Fidel Castro had planned. He gets a telegram. And this is, his son was there and he mentions it. It's documented in my book. Okay, launch a nuclear, this is October 28th of 1962, during the height of the missile crisis. You know, the whole world's going crazy. Khrushchev says, okay, launch an attack against the Americans. Preemptive, launch, press the buttons into Khrushchev because they're getting ready to attack us. Let's not let them get the first shot. And Khrushchev said, is this guy serious? I mean, he had spies, Khrushchev had spies here too, and he knew that it wasn't that imminent an invasion, and he says, placate him, placate Castro, tell him, look, if the Yankees attack Cuba, then we'll launch the missiles. He wasn't gonna do it. He later admitted he wasn't gonna do it, but he was doing that to put off Castro somehow. This guy's nuts, is he nuts? A day later, he gets another telegram. Nikita, they're already loading the landing crafts, man. Don't let them get the first shot. Launch the missiles now. And that's when Nikita Khrushchev blew up. He said, my God, is this guy crazy? Get his exact words, get the missiles out of Cuba before something terrible happens. Something terrible was pressing the buttons. A month later, Che Guevara thought he was talking off the record to the London Daily Worker. And he said, if the missiles had remained in Cuba, we would have launched them against the heart of the United States, including New York City. So Khrushchev was the butcher of Budapest, a man who had murdered millions of Ukrainians, his own people, Ukrainians and so forth, was horrified at a guy who is considered next to Mother Teresa by Time magazine. Again, you cannot possibly make this stuff up. And it just goes on and on. Folks, 20% of the Cuban population was driven out of an island that previously had net immigration. What happened in that interim between 57, when the guy said Castro was promising wonderful things for Cuba, and 2011, when Newsweek says it's the best place on earth to live? This regime murdered more political prisoners than Hitler's regime murdered in its first 6 years. Castro murdered more people in his first 3 years in power than Hitler murdered in his first 6. Obviously, I'm choosing before the Holocaust, but I'm talking about political prisoners who were executed. This regime, the Castro regime, jailed and tortured political prisoners at a higher rate than Stalin's did during the Great Terror. People say, but that's crazy, Humberto. How can you say something so insane? Folks, at one time in 1962 in Cuba, 350,000 Cubans were political prisoners. 300 out of a population of the time of 6.4 million. Now, if you read a fabulous book, Anne Applebaum's Gulag, great author, fabulous. She says that at any one time in the Soviet Gulag, there were about 2 million Soviet subjects in the Gulag. Take 2 million to the Soviet population at the time, which was 210 million, and compare it to 350,000 to the Cuban population at the time, which was 6.3 million. And that is why I say they jailed Susan Sontag, no less, actually admitted that in one of our books. She says it was about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Colombian communist, another way to put it, communist and Castro accomplice who recently died. Susan Sontag was writing about him about 20 years ago, and she says, I can't believe that a man who is so talented as an author would devote himself to hailing a regime, she said, a regime that jailed more political prisoners as a percentage of population than any regime on earth. You know, and yet, as I've mentioned to you, you see the same thing in Time, you see the same thing in Newsweek, you see it daily. Folks, prior to the Cuban Revolution, Cuba had, stand back, free health care. No, they did have hospitals for the indigent. You know, it wasn't free health care in the British model or the Canadian, but they did have hospitals that would take care of people. And Cuba at the time, 1958, had the 13th lowest infant mortality rate on earth. Cuba's infant mortality rate in 1958, before Castro took over, was better than it was in half of Europe, in Belgium, in France. Cubans own more cars per capita than did Japanese and Italian citizens, two nations, you know, known for their cars, in 1958. 20% of that population fled, and at great fear and at great risk to their lives. So, I mean, even if you don't like to read all this stuff, you know, even if you don't immerse yourself in Cuban literature, does it take a genius to figure out? Last week they picked up a boat The cruise line, Carnival Cruise Line, picked up a boat with 45 desperate Cubans. This was in USA Today, it was in Times-Picayune. And let me tell you, this was a better education of that big ship, Carnival Cruise Line. They said that the entire capacity of that cruise ship was cheering and clapping when they pulled those desperate Cubans. Oh, Lord. They said, they're quoted, they said, how desperate must people be to get, because the ship, I say a boat, it was a raft that was lashed to get inner tubes, styrofoam, and so the people, I mean, you know, middle-class Americans, not Manhattan press people, middle-class Americans are looking at this and they're going, my God, how desperate must people be to get out of the best country in the world to live, according to Newsweek, to put themselves, men, women, and children, in the boat. And they said the boat, everybody cheered, and they got out and so forth. So that's a better education about what's going on in Cuba than anything that I could possibly provide here. But a lot of our people are going, okay, Humberto, that was, you know, the missile crisis. What happened after that? A month after the missile crisis, let's go back to Manhattan now, because that's the press elite. A month after the missile crisis, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI uncovers a plot that involved placing 500 kilos of TNT in Macy's, Gimbel's, Bloomingdale's, and Grand Central Terminal, as it was known at the time, 1962. 500 kilos were going to go off on that date. What was the date? Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving of 1962. We had a heck of an FBI at the time. J. Edgar Hoover's people had infiltrated the plot. He had moles in it. What it was Castro's U.S. diplomats involved with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee folks in New York. Remember, this is November of '62. Exactly a year later, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee got a lot of press, didn't it? Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, in November of '62, J. Edgar Hoover busted the plot, and they rounded him up. And I've got the whole account of how it was done. It's thrilling. That was a heck of a FBI we had at the time. They didn't use computer. They didn't rely on computer. Then human intelligence, moles, gumshoe. They infiltrated. They rounded it up. Can you imagine how many lives they saved? Macy's, Gimbel's, Bloomingdale's, folks. The day after Thanksgiving, Macy's by itself gets 50,000 shoppers that day. Not at one time, but during the course of the Macy's Day Parade Day. Castro and Che playing a set off. And who's shopping? Women and children. They were going to blow them up. And people say, well, Humberto, where you come up with this crazy stuff? You know, that's almost too insane to believe, Humberto. Folks, documentation, you know where the document comes from? Look up the New York Times. November 23rd of 1962. And you'll see the faces of the culprits, of the terrorists. You see the faces. And you see the grenades and the fuses and so forth that were going to go off. No kidding, Humberto. And people say, but that's insane, Humberto. Why did he want to do this? Wouldn't he have known that we would have come down on him on a ton of bricks at that time? Well, with Kennedy, you're not so sure, but remember that was right after the missile crisis. And Castro and Che were both very, very perturbed that they didn't get their wish. The pressing of the buttons. And a worldwide nuclear, folks, can you imagine that? Like I say, Khrushchev was horrified. Castro and Che and Raul had reservations in the Soviet bomb shelter in Havana. So they would have emerged, aha, his wish from day one. The David against Goliath I slew the Yankees, and millions of Cubans dead, millions of American military, but now I'll get my name in Wikipedia as a David against Goliath, This is the kind of guy we're talking about that Jimmy Carter hugs and calls a close friend. We greeted each other as close friends. That's Jimmy Carter hugging, pictures of Jimmy hugging Fidel Castro 3 years ago when he went to Cuba. The man wanted to blow up his country twice. So what was Castro and Che were trying to do, no one knows for sure because you never know, with that bomb plot was reignite the missile crisis. That's the only explanation you can have. Reignite the missile crisis. And why didn't get more press, people say. Humberto, how do you dig this stuff up? New York Times, look it up. Because Kennedy had cut a deal with the Russians the month before. That's what ended the missile crisis. The Russians got the missiles out, and Kennedy said, you get the missiles out. Of course, they got them out, as I told you before, because they were terrified that these guys would get their fingers too close to the buttons. But he also made a deal. Kennedy said, okay, you get them out, and we promise not only will we not invade Cuba, the U.S., but we will not allow any other power in the Western Hemisphere to molest Castro. Woo-hoo. Now, you don't hear about Cuba in the media, anyway, without the pundit glowing. Isn't it amazing how Castro has outlasted 10 U.S. presidents, Well, it's not amazing at all. When you know that he was protected by the U.S. and by the Soviet Union. Oh, and it even gets better. The Soviet freedom fighters, Fernando Marquette, who was one, knows many of them, were launching raids from South Florida against Castro in '62. After the missile crisis, when Kennedy said, no more of that, we can't do that, we can't molest Castro anymore, some of them moved their operations to the Bahamas and started launching from the Bahamas. Kennedy got on the phone with his friend Harold Macmillan. He says, I got these crazy Cubans that went over there. You want to round them up for me? They're crazy. They're nuts. They're going to start a war. So think about it for a second, folks. Here we've got a guy, Fidel Castro. Everybody says, well, you got to hand it to him. He stood up to the U.S., the plucky underdog. No, folks. He hid behind the skirts of the Soviet Union, the United States, and who was running the Bahamas? The British Empire. So he had the three most powerful governmental entities on earth protecting him. And that's the plucky underdog who stuck up to the U.S. Like I say, it's not only that mostly what you read about Cubans is wrong. It's not just wrong. It's the opposite of the truth. The British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the U.S. all shielding his regime. Yeah, but Humberto, the CIA tried to assassinate Castro. Now, we all know they had about 600 assassination attempts, didn't they? E. Howard Hunt, who was involved with the CIA at the time of the 1960s, I do not know of any serious attempt by the CIA to assassinate Castro. You hear about these things, the exploding cigars, and this was all brainstorming primarily. Or brain something else, a phrase that's popular nowadays, but they never really got off the drawing board. I mean, they all fizzled out. So all this stuff about the U.S., being Castro's enemy from day one, is complete poppycock. As a matter of fact, the CIA, who was accused of trying to assassinate him time after time after time, I've got a quote from the man who was the CIA's station chief, Caribbean station chief from 1957 to 60, which is when Castro and Che were in the hills trying to come out. He says, me and my staff were all Fidelistas. The CIA was pro-Castro. The State Department was pro-Castro. The U.S. ambassador to Cuba in 1958, the last one we had, the second to last, said it in congressional testimony. He says, we put Castro in power. People say, well, Humberto, that's crazy. I thought Batista was a U.S.-backed dictator, and, you know, and the U.S., you know, like, no. We put, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I don't think that, you know, the CIA was part of the Bilderberger group and all that. I just think that they bought the propaganda from Castro that he was a democratic leftist. They bought into it. The CIA was working with the democratic left all around the world at the time. The Christian Democrats in Italy, in France, in Chile. They swore by it, and they thought Castro was part of that same group. I don't think that, you know, what is it? I don't like the CFR, but I don't think that it was part of a plot by them and so forth to do it. But the point is, he got into power. And then, but Humberto, you know, when Castro got into power, wouldn't it have been nice if the U.S. would have used a bit more carrot and a little less stick? Maybe we would have kept them from going over to the Russians. Complete poppycock. In 1958, when the CIA and the State Department are helping Castro, I have a documented record of a CIA agent handing a $5,000 check to a Castro agent in Santiago, Cuba. Castro wrote a secret letter that is no longer secret. He said, after this war is over, the one against Batista, which really wasn't a war, by the way, after this war is over, I'm going to start the one that I see as my true destiny. And that is my war to destroy the United States. So what I do with my books is try to tell them, you know, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro hit the news from time to time, not that often. And you always see in the media, well, Cuban exiles in South Florida are outraged. But apparently nobody else is, you know. And I keep telling you, folks, this shouldn't be a Cuban-American issue. Their hatred was for you folks. His hatred was for the United States. Both Che Guevara and Fidel Castro considered the U.S. the great enemy of mankind. In 1958, he said, my destiny is to destroy the United States. He went after Los Gusanos, the Cubans, the anti-communists, because he portrayed us as lackeys, as Yankee stooges. You know, we weren't hot, which is complete poppycock, by the way. In 1958, only 7% of Cubans were employed by U.S. companies. U.S. investments in Cuba only accounted for 14% of Cuba's GDP in 1959. But Humberto, that's not what I saw in The Godfather. I saw that the mafia ran Cuba, man. Come on. You know, folks, I've been having serious speeches of this type on college campuses. I'm on the YF PG. And I'll have what I would take to be an educated person rebut something that I'm saying right now by saying, yeah, but that's not what The Godfather said. In other words, The Godfather is a documentary on Cuba. You know, it is freaking. Now, The Godfather is my favorite movie of all time, don't get me wrong, but it is a movie, folks. It is a movie. In 1955, Cuba had a grand total of 3 gambling casinos. 3. And I total up in the book that you can get here, the total number of roulette wheels and tables and slot machines that they had, 1955. That year, 1 casino in Las Vegas, 1 had more gambling action and revenue than the entire island of Cuba. Yet you hear that the mafia ran Cuba. You know, and you hear about, well, you know, then we got the mafia to try to knock off Castro. They didn't lose that much when Castro threw them out. They were making so much more in Las Vegas, it wasn't worth their time to try to assassinate Castro. I mean, there are too many hazards in that. when they could just move the operation to Las Vegas? I mean, like I say, the whole thing. And yet we had Jon Stewart a few years ago. I devoted a chapter hosting a guy on his show. And what's frightening about this, folks, is that Jon Stewart is widely hailed as the top news source for Americans under 35. So he hosts a guy, an author on his show, Jon Stewart does, who wrote a book titled How the Mob Owned Cuba and Lost It to Castro's Revolution. And so Jon Stewart brings him on and says, wow, everything I know, and he admits, he says, this is a quote, everything I know about pre-Castro Cuba, I learned from Godfather too. But according to this book, it was actually worse, huh? Wow! So this is what people are learning about Cuba, and it is complete poppycock. There were gambling casinos. Cuba was a nice place to visit in the 1950s, but it didn't dominate the economy. Even anywhere near Las Vegas, gambling dominates Las Vegas. Cuba's economy was diversified. We had a higher standard of living per capita income than half of European countries. During the 1950s and 40s, Cuba took in immigrants. This is something that I always tell people, say, well, Humberto, you know, you Cubans are always trying to sneak over here in boats. But of course, Mexicans and El Salvadorans are also trying to come across. What's the difference? But that wasn't the case before communism. Plus, there's a little bit of a difference between jumping on a piece of styrofoam and going across 90 miles of shark-infested waters than there is in jumping a fence in San Diego. It is a little bit different. And this is something that I devoted a chapter to in my book, because I wonder, what is the Discovery Channel's top show in National Geographic? It's Shark Week. Shark Week. Everybody loves Shark Week. And then when I'm watching Shark Week, they talk about, oh, there was a shark attack in the Philippines. There was a shark attack in Tahiti and in Hawaii. And so, wait a minute now. What about the Florida Straits for the last 50 years? If you folks want to feature, you know, gut-wrenching type of stuff, what's wrong with going down to Key West and interviewing the people landing there from Cuba? I got some of their stories about jumping over just dazed from dehydration, from sun, from thirst, jumping over to the sun. The guy jumps over and he is ripped apart by sharks. These kids watch their father ripped apart by sharks alive. Why is that not? Wouldn't you think that would make an ideal feature for the Discovery Channel? But the Discovery Channel has a partnership with the Castro regime, don't you see? They produce a lot of shows about the coral reef, about the wonderful things that the Castro regime is doing for conservation of coral reefs. So this is the thing that happens. If you want a Havana Bureau, if you want a report from Cuba, you're going to play their game. Now, I have to keep reminding myself that it's been, you know, decades since the Iron Curtain fell, and most people don't realize what communism is anymore. They don't realize what communism is. It used to be in the 40s and 50s and 60s, if you see something come out of Moscow, of Bucharest, Budapest, East Berlin, from the news, you say, well, you know, take it with a grain of salt. This has been doctored by the communists. But that is not the case when you see Associated Press, Havana, Reuters, Havana, ABC, Havana. Let's talk about ABC, Havana. And let's talk about Michael Moore's Sicko. Michael Moore's Sicko showed Cuba's healthcare, you know, to surpass Denmark's, you know, is showing. Don't you know that Michael Moore films are shown for free from one end of Cuba to the other? Famous Castro himself, Fidel, not Raul, called Michael Moore an extraordinary American. Okay. He comes out and he shows sicko. Cuban dissidents, actual Cubans who saw that film, were horrified. They're so used to Castro's propaganda getting out there. They're so used to it. As a matter of fact, like Che Guevara said in his diaries, he said, in 1958, much more important than guerrilla recruits for our army were American media recruits to our sport, our propaganda. And so Cuban dissidents saw, here we go again. Now the world's going to think we got this wonderful health care out there. And these were people actually, they were so outraged by it that some of them snuck little mini cameras into actual Cuban hospitals. The ones that Joe Sixpack and Soccer Mom, Cuba. Not that you can get a six-pack in Cuba, or play soccer, you know, or get a van to drive your kids, but the regular Cubans use. In those films, and they snuck them out by diplomatic pouch, the Czech embassy snuck them out to Mexico and got them to Miami. And ABC had promised to show them. The show is going to be what Michael Moore did show. I mean, a blockbuster. Holy moly, here we're going to go. Michael Moore, here it is, and here it is in film measure. The Castro regime got wind that those films had been snuck out. And they called in the ABC honchos, the Havana Bureau. And they said, you know something? If y'all show these, we're going to have to reconsider renewing your Cuba visa. And don't you know that John Stossel, who I normally admire, was the one who was going to show this on his show. But apparently, this was in 2009. He didn't have the clout in ABC that he should have had. He knuckled under. In essence, the Castro regime blackmailed ABC. They knuckled out, and they didn't show the films of what actual Cuban hospitals look like. They did a diluted version. John Stossel ran it, but it was diluted. It didn't show the more horrifying. My friends in South Florida, Jorge Utzet, who some of my friends here know well, was the one who had these films. He said, Humberto, these people literally risked their lives to take them, to sneak them out of Cuba, and now ABC welches on the thing. What are we going to do? Hold on, Jorge, hold on. Just don't despair just yet. I got on the horn to O'Reilly's people and to Hannity's people at Fox. Within a minute and a half, both the producers had called back. Hannity called first, so he got him. And Hannity did a show that you can see on YouTube right now. What Michael Moore didn't shoot. Hannity showed the horror. It showed in actual Cuban hospitals. Patients on bare, filthy brown mattresses covered in flies. Horrible. The horrible conditions of what a Cuban hospital actually looks like. Vicente Botín, who was a reporter for a Spanish newspaper and TV station, wrote a book. It's only available in Spanish, sadly. But he said it. He left Cuba. He was thrown out of Cuba. And basically, he said it very succinctly. When you get a visa to report from Cuba, reporter's visa, you play the regime's game or you're out of there. Or you're out of there. And that explains why most of what I've spoken tonight is unknown in the United States. They doctor just about everything that is coming out of Cuba. We spoke about the Council on Foreign Relations a little while ago. Julia Swig is a lady, she is known as the Latin American expert for the Council on Foreign Relations. If you pick up the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, major, and the issue is Cuba, they will go to her and get her quotes and her take on the issue. She has been identified by Christopher Simmons, Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Simmons, who was the Defense Intelligence Agency's top Cuba spy catcher. He booted 14 Castro spies from the U.S., including Ana Belén Montes, had a key role in her, who was considered the most dangerous spy in the U.S. since the end of the Cold War. He was responsible for that. He identified the Council on Foreign Relations, Julius Swig, as a Castro agent of influence. And she's a dumb one. That's the bad part. She's a dumb one. Because in the acknowledgments to her book, she thanks some Cubans for helping her. She wrote a book about everything you need to know about Cuba. And in the acknowledgments, she says, in Cuba, these folks opened doors for me, and I could not have done without their warm friendship of health. 7 of them were spies that had been booted from the U.S. by Simmons. 2 of them were involved in the bomb plot that I mentioned to you about Macy's. And yet the media will quote her at random. Anytime, Cuba. No one will know. No one would know from reading her accounts that she thanks 7 Castro espionage agents. And that is how she gets a lot of her information. This is utterly unknown in the United States. You know, we hear about Barbara Walters is retiring, and I devoted a whole chapter of this. How many of the people here realize that the only regime in the Western Hemisphere to jail and torture thousands, 31,590 women were jailed and tortured by the Castro regime for political crimes. This is utterly unknown, folks, in the Western Hemisphere. Not only in Cuba, but it's utterly unknown until Castro came in. Some of these ladies, I was honored to interview them, and they talked about the conditions. What really sent many of them over, they're in a cell, completely dark. They were called tapiadas, completely dark. You can barely stand in them. Stifling heat. The toilet is a hole in the floor where rats would come in and out. This is all documented. Rats were coming up. So they were sitting there and, nothing. They were caked in menstrual fluid and everything else, beaten, so forth. This is all in the book. That's bad enough. The women's prison was not too far from the men's prison, were the firing squads. Che Guevara's firing squad, he started them, but they kept going for years, were going off. The women said it what really took them over the edge. They were in their cell in these conditions that I mentioned to you. Beaten, bloodied, festering sores on them. And they'd hear the volleys going off. Firing squad. And the guards would come and taunt them through the little peephole. We just shot your husband. We just shot your son. We just shot your granddad. They said that took them over. These things happen 90 miles away, folks. 90 miles. It is reported nowhere in the U.S. media. What is the top theme in the women's shows? The View, any of them. How she got her groove back. Women overcoming adversity. Folks, there are ladies living in South Florida, Cuban ladies, who suffered what I'm just telling you. They suffered 10, 15 years of prison. They are the longest suffering female political prisoners in modern history. They suffered, some of them, twice as long as Elena Bonner did in the Soviet Union. They are utterly unknown in the United States. Folks, you want to talk about getting your groove back? Go through what these ladies went through in Cuba. 10, 15 years of these horrors. Come to Miami and start anew and get the family going again. That, my friends, is getting your groove back. And that should be on the View. So I asked Caridad Roque, Carrie Rock, and several of them, Ana Rodriguez, well, why aren't y'all in the media? The strikes, they said, the media has never shown any interest in any of our stories. But now, if you were bullied for being a lesbian on school, then it's all over. But if you're tortured in a cell for 15 years, 90 miles from U.S. shores, and you're now U.S. citizens, that doesn't count. That's what I say. It's a twilight zone situation. And now some of y'all are going, well, brother, this is old time stuff. Who cares about the Cold War and stuff? Who cares? Folks, Cuba is being run right now essentially by the same guys who ran it in 1962. Raul Fidel's in the, I say Raul rules, Fidel reigns, kind of in the background. Ramiro Valdez, it's a lot of the same, except for Che, Merezen. It's the same group. 4 months ago, I read something, and it said that the Castro regime said that they were going to start freezing accounts, bank accounts, linked to Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. Stop. They were going to stop. So I said, wait a minute. This is the famous gotcha question. When are you going to stop beating your wife? You know, in other words, they are admitting that they've been laundering funds for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda all during 9/11 and since then? I guess so. They said, well, okay, we're going to finally stop handling funds linked to Al-Qaeda and Taliban. So a regime 90 miles from U.S. shores that came closest to blowing up the United States, as I mentioned to you before, they craved to do it, and who up until 4 months ago said, okay, we stopped. Who knows if they stopped? But if they were doing up to 4 months ago, terror sponsoring regime. They are classified, Cuba is classified by the United States State Department as a state sponsor of terror. The FARC in Colombia. Their death toll over the last 40 years surpasses that of Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Taliban combined, primarily in South America and Central America and the U.S. The leader of that group, in 2002, he gave an interview and he said, we owe our survival to Fidel Castro. So the Castro regime is responsible for the most, keeping alive the most murderous terrorist regime really in the world. We hear about Mideast terrorists, but we don't typically hear a lot of, except from Ms. Monica Showalter, we don't hear a lot about South American terrorist regimes. And they're there. They're working on our border. Los Zetas. Los Zetas are working on our border, smuggling people into Arizona and New Mexico through our southern border. 3 years ago, Castro's vice-nephew, El Boris del Valle, was caught working with them in Cancun. This is documented in his book. So when people say, yes, it's Cold War stuff, look, Juanita Castro, Castro's sister, defected in 1964. And she came to the U.S. and she addressed Congress. And from the questions she was, and the rebuttal she was getting, and this and that and the other, in 1964, she finally stopped and she said, and she looked around and she said, you people don't get it. She didn't say don't get it because that wasn't used in 1964, but she used the equivalent terminology of the time. She says, you people don't understand, you Americans don't understand the passion of my brother's hatred for your country. You don't understand the depth of his hatred for you people. His goal, his obsession is to destroy you. That was in 1965, and he tried with the missile crisis. He tried it again in 1982 when we liberated Grenada in 1983. Castro got scared. That was Reagan. Grenada's kind of close by. It looks like this guy, cowboy diplomacy might wash up on my shoulders. He went to the Soviets again. Look, y'all get ready with the missiles, because I think Reagan's going to come after me. The cowboy's going to come after me. By that time, the Soviets said, tough, that's your problem. You handle it yourself. We ain't going to get in a war with Reagan, because they were scared of Reagan. Whereas nobody was scared of Kennedy. That was the difference. And that's essentially why, if Richard Nixon had won the election of 1960, I would have written other types of books, but if Richard Nixon had won, he would have gone in at the Bay of Pigs. He would have. He was the main booster. He was known as the main booster for the Bay of Pigs invasion. He started planning it. April of 1959. What happened in April 59? Fidel Castro visits the United States. Naturally, ABC, CBS, National Press Club, Washington, accolades everywhere. Ike didn't want to meet him. Ike went to play golf, and he dropped it in Nixon's lap. So Nixon met Castro. Nixon met with the CIA guys, Frank Bender, and they were infatuated with him. The CIA guy goes, not only is Castro an anti-communist, he's a strong anti-communist fighter, and he's going to help us defeat communism in the Western Hemisphere. This is the CIA's Latin American expert, folks. How do they hire these people? Where do you come up with these people? Well, after that meeting, Castro goes and meets Nixon, Vice President Nixon. Nixon talked to him for about an hour. Nixon came out of that meeting. He went over to Ike and stuff. We're going to have to do something about this guy. Isn't it interesting that the first official who saw through Alger Hiss was the first to see through Fidel Castro in Washington? He saw what was coming, and he started planning the Bay of Pigs invasion. Come the debates, October of 1960. And this must have been galling, how Nixon bit his lip. At that time, Fernando and his folks were already being trained to invade Cuba and liberate Cuba from Castro. Kennedy knew that because Allen Dulles had told him that. But Kennedy came across as the hawk on Cuba in the debates. He accused Nixon and Eisenhower, y'all have allowed a communist beachhead 90 miles from U.S. shores. How can you do such a thing? When I'm up there, I'm going to take care of these And Nixon's going, he knows that we're already planning an invasion, but he couldn't. But to Nixon, national security trumped debate scoring points. He says, I can't divulge that we're training these guys. Fernando's down in Guatemala getting trained, We can't divulge that we're helping train them to defeat, Kennedy's talking point. So he bit his lip, and Kennedy won the election by a squeaker, as we know, partly maybe because he was seen as the hawk on a threat 90 miles from shore. So the Bay of Pigs lands in his lap, and the rest is history. The Bay of Pigs we hear, when you all hear about it in the media and the news, you hear fiasco, you hear disaster, fiasco. Folks, these guys came within a hair of winning. 1,500 of these guys, a couple of them in this room right here, landed on the beach. They inflicted casualties of 20-1. They had 1 day's ammunition. They inflicted casualties of 20-1 against Castro's Soviet-armed and Soviet-led troops. The U.S. fleet was offshore, part of it. Aircraft carriers loaded with deadly high Skyhawk jets, missiles on them, 50 caliber machine guns just raring to take off. Kennedy said, no, we can't do it. We can't get involved in this. Admiral Arleigh Burke was the chief of naval operations at the time. He was getting the reports from the beachhead. Look, Castro's Air Force, which was supposed to have been knocked out before the invasion. That's the whole gist of it. Castro's Air Force was supposed to be knocked out. Kennedy's people got cold feet. They canceled the airstrikes that were to take out the Air Force. Look, this invasion was planned by Marines, by military guys. 61, they were all veterans of World War II, Marines from the Pacific, from Incheon and so forth. We need air superiority or this thing ain't gonna work it. They stress that to the best and the brightest, right? But the best and the brightest, what it boils down to is that they had a guilty conscience about it. These were Ivy League beltway types, and they were ashamed of U.S. cowboy diplomacy. They were ashamed of U.S. gunboat. They had a guilty conscience about it. And they thought that the airstrikes would give away the U.S. role in it. But like I told Kennedy, 2 days after it was over, what the heck did you think people were going to think? That we weren't involved in the thing? But he called off the airstrikes. These guys were surrounded on a beachhead, 20,000 Castro's troops moving in. They ran out of ammunition. They are calling to the U.S. ships just offshore, we're out of ammo. You guys are going to... And so the ship said, we can come in and evacuate you. And these guys said, no, we will not be evacuated. We came here to fight. This ends here. They fought to the last bullet. I'm thinking of writing my next book called The Last Bullet. They literally fought to the last bullet. They were captured. And then the real heroics set in. Because remember, people were being murdered by firing squad in Cuba at the time for a lot less than what these guys had inflicted on the Castro regime. So they all thought they were going to the firing squad. It was only normal. They all thought they were going to firing squad. Fernandito back here and one of his friends told me they were captured. Naturally, the shooting was over. When they were all captured, Che Guevara walks up. Ha ha! Strutting, like he always does, because the shooting was over. And he got some of the soldiers, Manel and Fernandito knows them, were in an enclosure. They were defeated, totally. And Che looked over. And Manel asked him, well, I guess we're going to the firing squad now, huh? And Che said, no, we're not going to send you to the firing squad. That's too good. We're going to hang all of you. Folks, this is a military command. Combat is over. And Manel tells me that he was right under Che, and he looked up at his face and he says, when I saw that, we're going to hang it, I realized that the man was sick. There was something wrong with this guy. He could probably be classified as a clinical sadist. Castro is a psychopath. The murders didn't affect him one way or the other. There were means to a goal. The goal was absolute power. But Che relished the murder. Manel tells me, when I saw that look on his face, there's some, look, you can find more bloodthirsty passages, probably from George Patton. But that was before and during combat, to fire up the troops. This was after combat. Combat was over, the men were utterly defenseless. Che, we're going to hang all of y'all. There was something seriously, seriously wrong with this guy. The guy who trained Che Guevara for their invasion of Cuba, Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, and Che came from Mexico, invaded Cuba in 1957. One of the guys who trained them there, a guy named Miguel Sanchez, El Coreano, because he was a U.S. Korean War vet, he was training Che, and he recalled in some interviews that during the training, after, Che would always come up to him and say, Miguel, you kill people in Korea? What's it feel like to kill people? And Sanchez was a professional military man. Well, you don't think of it. It's a duty. You point your gun and you shoot at a uniform. That's what we're supposed to do. That's our job. But Che said, yeah, but I want to know what it feels like to kill somebody. I want to know. The man was ill, mentally ill. We don't know the number of murders in Cuba. We can go to the Black Book of Communism that reports 16,000 firing squad murders in Cuba. Again, a population of 6.4 million. That would be over a million, 2 million executions in the US. And the Black Book of Communism, by the way, folks, is not a Cuban exile publication. Because if we say it, well, that's those Cubans, they got an axe to grind, You can't believe what they're saying. The Black Book of Communism was written by French intellectuals and translated into English by Harvard University Press. not exactly a branch of the vast right-wing conspiracy. 16,000 firing squad murders in Cuba. And when he was at the United Nations in 1964, naturally getting a standing ovation by the General Assembly, a renegade diplomat from Panama asked him, you know, what about the people that y'all are executing, murdering, the firing squad? And Che said, yes, we proudly execute. Fusilamos means firing squad. Fusilamos, and we will keep fusilando as long as it is necessary. This is a war to the end against the imperialist enemy. So he admitted it. He did it. Naturally, the UN General Assembly being what it is, he got another standing ovation. There. You see? And yet, he shows up in Times Magazine, Heroes and Icons, next to Mother Teresa. Doris, am I taking up too much time, or do we have a question? Because this stuff, I'm telling you, the ironies, you can go on with this stuff. We'll take it chronologically. Let's go back to this so-called guerrilla war. You know, I've given you highlights of what's in this war, but because you'll hear, well, Fidel and Che took over Cuba after a guerrilla war. There was no guerrilla war in Cuba. The U.S. Embassy and the CIA did a count in 1959, and they guesstimated that about 180 people died Cuba-wide during a 3-year so-called civil war. 180 people, folks, that's less than half of Chicago's murder rate last year. 383 people, that's about half of it, died in Chicago for murders. There was no guerrilla war in Cuba at the time. They took power, people were disgusted with the regime, and basically Batista's army didn't have the wherewithal to fight. They said, well, you know, Batista's doomed and so forth. So they take over. And then we hear, gosh, the U.S. granted Fidel Castro diplomatic recognition in record time. The people that tell you, we pushed Castro into the arms of the Soviets. We should have been nice to him. And, you know, and he wouldn't have gone to the Russians. We gave his regime diplomatic recognition faster than we had given Batista's. In fact, faster than we had given any regime in Latin America. Record diplomatic recognition. During the first year in office, Eisenhower typically delegated very well, but he delegated very poorly for the State Department's Latin American experts. And they were bending over backwards. You know, Castro's tantrums, attacking the United States, attacking the... What's going on? The United States made 10 different back-channel attempts to mend fences. From our side, there were no fences to mend. But they made 10 back-channel attempts to ascertain the cause of Castro's tantrums during that full year. What else can we do? Can we do, sir? And they were rebuffed each and every time. Raul Castro had had a KGB handler since 1956. So this thing, when people tell you, you know, we lost Cuba to the Russians by being, no. This thing was planned from day one by the Soviets and their faithful agents in Cuba. And again, you would really think that after 50 some odd years, we're almost going on 60 years, that some of this information would have permeated to through the media out there. But as I give these talks around the country, in college, universities, and I don't blame, you know, the American people, you know. But I'm thinking, if you pick up and you read in the media about Cuba, you're going to read about this terrible embargo that the U.S. That's all you're going to read about. Folks, how many of y'all realize that twice as many people visited Cuba from the United States last year as visited in 1958 during Godfather time. Cuba was a tourist playground in 58, wasn't it? We started in the Godfather. Last year, close to 500,000, 450,000 people visited Cuba from the United States. The cash flow from the United States to Cuba nowadays, primarily remittances from recent arrivals from Cuba, is estimated, if you put together travel expenses and remittances, the cash flow from the US to Cuba is about $4 billion last year. When Cuba was a proud and unabashed Soviet colony, they got about $3.8 billion from the Soviets in the 70s. So, step back for a second again. The nation that embargoes Cuba sends twice as many tourists there as were there in the 50s, and more cash than used to go there from their Soviet patrons. Folks, that is not an embargo, any way you call it. There are sanctions in place, but it is not an embargo. I don't care how you want to call it. And all of that money, the problem is, lands in the coffers, in the pockets of the regime, not the Cuban people. There are many well-meaning people, I hear it daily, but you know, if we just lifted the embargo, if we let people go to Cuba, wouldn't that undermine Castro? You know, well-meaning people, many of them, not all of them. Like they say about terrorists, well, Humberto, not all Islamic jihadists are terrorists. No, but all all terrorists are Islamic jihadists. You know, like I say, well, Humberto, not everybody who's against the embargo is a Castro agent. No, but every Castro agent is against the Cuban embargo. I'll tell you that. Because they don't realize that, and I tell them, you don't know. You read in the media about an embargo. You think we're closing it off. You don't realize what's been going on for a decade. This avalanche of money going to Castro from the United States and from the rest of the world. And as a result, last year Cubans suffered record repression. Right now, political arrests in Cuba right now are at a 10-year high. Not in spite of all that money and tourists going to Cuba, but because of it. Because the regime is fat and happy. Fat and happy. All of the money, I always say, a dictator gets doomed when his military starts defecting. That's what doomed Gaddafi a couple of years ago. And that's what hasn't doomed Maduro just yet. The Venezuelan military is fat and happy from all the narco trafficking money. The day I hear that some of Castro's military is thinking of defecting, that's when I know he's doomed. But what does Castro do? The tourist industry is owned lock, stock, and barrel by the Cuban military and the secret police. So the guys with the guns in Cuba are fat and happy, you know, and that is why Cuba is still a police state. They're not dumb, you know, and that's what I tell people. You have to realize capitalism, tourism is not going to blindside the Castro regime. The guys running Cuba grew up under capitalism, so they know what it looks like, and they were all utter failures during that stage of Cuban process. So it's not like it's going to blindside them. Cuba is, sadly, it doesn't speak well of it, Cuba's the only country that went from capitalist prosperity to communism. You know, Eastern Europe didn't have any choice. The Red Army rolled in. Korea, the same thing in the Red War. Most countries went communist after the end of World War II because they had no choice. Cuba went voluntary. So the guys that run Cuba know what capitalism looked like, know that if it comes back, they're going to be failures again. So they are very vigilant about what they allow in the private sector. And anytime something properly describable as genuine free market capitalism, they chop it off. So when your friends and your colleagues tell you, well, you know, things are changing in Cuba, I hear about these reforms. No. The guys who put those reforms in place know what capitalism looks like. The minute they sense a threat, boom, it's all over. I'm ready to take questions from y'all because I'm talking about stuff you may not even be interested in, so now I'll address it. I'm going to do it like Phil Donahue.
Is there any connection to Bill Ayers, the Underground?
Bill Ayers?
Our favorite friend next to the White House.
Bill Ayers, Bernardine Dorn visited Cuba for training. The Weathermen were essentially a recruiting force for Castro's DGI. DGI is Castro's KGB trained intelligence. That's in my book. Bernardine Ayers, I couldn't find proof that Ayers himself visited Cuba. Bernardine Dorn did. And they set up here and they were tasked with finding people in the U.S. who would serve as agents for the DG. They were like recruiters for Castro's secret police and spy service.
And an update on today, the connection.
And who?
Today's connection, same people with Castro.
Today's connection?
Yeah.
Well,
Bernardine Dorn in Colombia, Bill Ayers visiting the White House.
Well, I have not seen him regret anything he did in Cuba, put it that way. You know, but the Weathermen, they learned their bomb making. They were taking a book, and they were learning their bomb making in Cuba, and then they had the bomb that blew up in Greenwich Village for them. So I guess they didn't learn that well when they were in Cuba. But that, yeah, Glenn Beck was good enough to run portion of my book in this Blaze magazine, and it's a chapter on Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn. Yeah, but because it's the opening chapter of the book. Yeah, it's the opening chapter.
Okay, this is going to be the last question, and then you can ask over it.
Vladimir Putin's latest move. Vladimir Putin.
Who?
Putin.
Oh, Vladimir, yeah.
His latest move is to meet Xi Jinping, the premier of China, to
Right.
make their oil deal. So now the new concept is the alliance between China and Russia. They tried it back in the 70s. But what do you anticipate when Raul and Fidel finally meet their maker? What do you think will happen relative to China and Russia and Cuba?
It started. Russian naval ships were in Cuba 2 weeks ago. They were in Cuba, so it's already starting. Again, as I mentioned, as long as the military is fat and happy in Cuba, they're going to keep it going. People always say, well, what's going to happen after Raul and Fidel die? I'd love to be optimistic, but the fact is, it's not just them two. They've got a military that is, you know, there's probably a couple thousand guys in Cuba. Cuba is a military dictatorship in the most genuine sense of the term, which is why you never hear it called that in the media. It is a military dictatorship. Castro's military runs the country. They're fat and happy. They don't want to upset their little apple cart. You see, they don't want to let competitors into their tourist industry because they've never known anything like that. They're monopolists, dictatorial. So I fear, like I said, unless there are some semi-decent or moral people in that military, and after 50 years, the Castros are very careful to weed out anybody and send them to the firing squad or to jail or into exile. Sadly, as long as the guys with the guns in Cuba are fat and happy, I don't see anything changing. And they're very fat and happy right now because of the tourism.
But who would be put in place? Who would...
It will be, they seem to think it will be Raul Castro's son. It's a dynasty. You know, it's a military dictatorship and a dynasty, which is why you never hear it called that. Raul Castro's son is being already, Alejandro is his name, is being groomed for it. And that's another thing. In the U.S., if you all pick up the New York Times or something, they love to quote, besides Julius Swig, they love to quote a guy named Arturo Lopez Levy. Levy, that's a name that would resound here. Arturo. That's not his real name. he has some Jewish heritage, but it's this, and his real name is Arturo Lopez Callejas. He is Raul Castro's nephew-in-law. He was a Cuban intelligence officer up until a few years ago, and then he came to the United States mysteriously, and now he's a lecturer at Denver University, and for some reason, every time you pick up the media, oh, Arturo Lopez Levy, of course he changed his name, he started using Levy when he came to the U.S., because that would sound better around here, you see, and you would get him in with the media and so forth. But they quote him, he is Raul Castro's nephew-in-law, and we know that he was a Castro intelligence analyst for years. They say he broke with them, but from what you read, I haven't seen any proof that he broke with them. That's the thing about it. I look up the Foreign Agents Registration section of the Justice Department. You see, because you can do this stuff legally. Everything that I'm talking about in my books, this can be done legally if you sign up as an agent of a foreign government. You can be their propagandist. What gets my gut is that they don't. And there is nobody signed up right now in the Justice Department as a foreign agent for the Castro regime. And technically, everybody I'm talking about in the book should be arrested. Technically, if they went by the letter of the law. It's amazing, but I think it boils down to, are they being remunerated? Are they getting money from the regime? And that's the hard thing to pin down, but I pinned it down in my book. One of these guys who constantly propagandizes for the Castro regime, we found a court discovery document that is in my book. He was getting under-the-table payments from a company in Canada, Sherritt International, a gigantic, one of the world's biggest mining company that does business in Cuba. What they did is they took over a U.S.-owned mining company, the Moa nickel plant, one of the biggest nickel plant in the world. I think it was the biggest at the time. Castro stole it at Soviet gunpoint, lock, stock, and barrel, like he stole $7 billion in U.S. property. Stole it. He stole the plant, and a Canadian company is running it now. So they are accessories to theft. They are trading in stolen property. And the executives of this company are not allowed to come into the U.S. because of the embargo law. So one of Castro's propagandists who in the media, oh, he's an expert, this and that and the other, I discovered he was getting under-the-table payments from Sherritt International to work against the embargo so their executives could come to the U.S. A lot of good stuff in that book.
Thank you.